On an April afternoon in 1994, a 15-year-old Florida girl gets off her school bus at the entrance to the dirt road leading to her home. From there, she still had about a quarter of a mile to walk. The narrow road cut through thick Florida brush, with dense vegetation pressing in on both sides and tree branches overhead creating an almost continuous canopy. It was a walk she knew well, and one that usually took only about 5 minutes. But this time, she never made it home. Later that afternoon, she was reported missing. A sheriff's helicopter found her body not far from where she had gotten off the bus. Investigators eventually arrested a suspect, but before the case could ever go to trial, the case against him unraveled. Today, 32 years later, detectives are still trying to figure out who killed her so close to home. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Laralee Spear. Hi, everyone, and thank you for listening this week. Today's case takes place in DeLand, Florida, a city about 35 miles north of Orlando, and the seat of Volusia County. In 1994, roughly 20,000 people called DeLand home, giving it the feel of a smaller community where many residents knew one another. The city is known for its historic downtown, brick-lined streets, and towering live oak trees draped with Spanish moss. While DeLand itself has long been a busy community, it doesn't take long to leave neighborhoods and businesses behind. On the outskirts of the city, paved roads give way to sandy dirt roads, dense woods, and stretches of rural property that can feel surprisingly secluded despite being only minutes from town. That is the part of town where 15-year-old Laralee Spear lived. Laralee was the middle of David and Barbara Spear's 3 daughters. Her older sister was Cassie, and her younger sister, Virginia, went by Ginny. The family had only been living in their split-level home on Deerfoot Road for about a year after moving to the area. Although Laralee had to change schools, she quickly settled in and made friends almost immediately. By the spring of 1994, she was a sophomore who stayed busy. She was active in her church and sang in the church choir. She was involved in several extracurricular activities, and she had recently achieved one of her biggest goals by earning a spot on the JV cheerleading squad, the Bulldogs. Laralee was an A-plus student who dreamed of being a doctor someday. In fact, her friends at school said that whenever she was given the option of writing a report on something, she would pick some topic related to medicine. She also loved helping out other students, both academically and emotionally. On April 25, 1994, Laralee had a normal day of school. Her best friend Carolyn saw her just before she got on the school bus to go home. Carolyn and Laralee were inseparable. They would often ride bikes together, feed horses, and play violin. They were talking before Laralee got on the bus because they were supposed to see each other that night at a school club both were hoping to participate in. She said goodbye to Laralee, and she boarded the bus home. Laralee then sat with her friend Vanessa, who said that Laralee was in good spirits. One of the clubs she was in dealt with charity and acts of kindness at school, and as part of that, Laralee was supposed to show up in school the next day dressed in a silly costume, and the girls had been laughing about that. Then, at 3:15 p.m., the bus pulled up to the intersection of Deerfoot Road and Spring Garden Lane South. I'm going to have photos and maps on our Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod, but I do want to give you a little description of the area. The bus was on Spring Garden Lane South, and Deerfoot Road was a pretty well-traveled road that took you into DeLand if you were on the main stretch. However, where Laralee and her family lived at 1425 Deerfoot Road, it was almost like a private trail. Technically, it was a through road out to Fatio Road, but it turned into dirt. For most people, Deerfoot Road essentially ended at Spring Garden Lane, and the continuation point onto that part where Laralee lived was so narrow that only one car could fit down the pathway in either direction at a time. From there, Laralee normally would be home by 3:20ish. When she wasn't home like clockwork, her mom grew worried. She didn't immediately see her outside, and so Barbara called over to Carolyn's house, where Carolyn was home playing the violin. She asked if there was any chance Laralee was there, and Carolyn said no. Carolyn told Barbara how responsible Laralee was and said she was sure everything was fine, and that there was a reasonable explanation, and that she would be home and return soon. But the teenager's words did little to comfort Barbara Spear. The mother knew something was off, and at 4:05 p.m. she contacted the Volusia County Sheriff's Department, who responded immediately. By 4:13, deputies were dispatched and they began looking by 4:25. After a brief search of the area did not show any signs of Laralee, they brought in Air 1, the sheriff's rescue helicopter. It would be 5:35 when their overhead search would yield a horrific discovery. On Deerfoot Road sat the remains of a home that had burned down a year earlier. As the helicopter flew overhead, the crew spotted what appeared to be the body of the missing teenager. She was lying on a concrete slab just outside the burned structure, partially concealed by the surrounding underbrush. This was beyond Laralee's home and closer to Fatio Road. Deputies on the ground raced to the area and confirmed the tragic findings. Laralee Spear was dead, the victim of a violent attack where she had been shot multiple times. Laralee's family was understandably inconsolable. Her younger sister Ginny couldn't make sense of it. She and Laralee had just watched The Sound of Music together the night before. How was she so suddenly gone? It wouldn't take long for word to spread to the community. That evening, Laralee had been noticeably absent from the school club, and her friend Carolyn had begun to worry. That night, Carolyn picked up the phone after it rang, and on the other line was their youth pastor. He had a shaky voice and asked to speak to Carolyn's father, who then had to break the devastating news to her about her best friend. Volusia County Sheriff Bob Bosco dedicated 30 deputies and investigators to work the case full-time right from the jump. Just as they had been quick to spring into action for the disappearance, they brought that same energy when responding to the homicide. The Deerfoot Road neighborhood was a rural neighborhood that kept an eye on one another. Only a half-dozen homes existed on the winding, tree-covered, path-like street. Detectives planned to talk to all of them. One neighbor near the foot of the path saw Laralee at 3:15 as she got off the bus. Another neighbor, an older man who used a wheelchair, said he typically sat outside on afternoons and would notice Laralee as she walked up the path each day. On that day, he wasn't feeling well, so there was one less set of eyes in the neighborhood watch. Early on in the investigation, police were very quiet about the details of the crime. They would not state if she was sexually assaulted, what type of weapon was used, how many times she was shot. They did say they believed the crime was isolated and not connected to any other cases. They also shared that the area was not known to be a party area for teens or anything, and they knew of no activity that occurred in this area that would be related, except for the fact that sometimes kids would practice shooting in the area, like they would do target practice, and that there may have been people doing target practice that day. They felt that the perp was familiar with the Deerfoot Road area and was a local versus just passing through. They wouldn't speak to a motive, though they felt they had a good idea of the motive. One classmate, William Conway, often got off at the stop with her, but that day he didn't, and he said it was of his opinion that someone must have followed her. Police asked that people come forward if they saw any suspicious people or vehicles in the area that day. And from that request, that's how police got their first leads. They were told by at least 5 different individual witnesses that a black truck was spotted driving around the area of Laralee's bus stop around 2:30 to 4:30 p.m. that day. Now, of course, as the police do, they said at first, we just want to talk to this guy. We don't think that he's a suspect. We just think he's a witness and he could provide information. I always love that move because clearly they definitely want to talk to him as if he's involved, but they put it out there as just a witness. It was a late model, possibly Ford pickup truck with a running board. Cheryl Downs, the public information officer for the sheriff's department, said, quote, "The driver is a white male with sandy hair just below the ears," end quote. She also said, "We are going back to houses where we've been before and interviewing people again and have uniformed deputies at both ends of Deerfoot stopping motorists." Within days of her murder, 550 classmates, friends, family, and community members poured into the Church of God in DeLand, where Laralee was a member and a choir standout. In fact, the pastor remembered, quote, "Last week, Laralee sang with her eyes closed, just like she was singing to God. I choose to picture Laralee in the presence of God right now, and she is singing to him." The community came together with a $1,000 reward that quickly turned into a $5,000 reward. The parents were in a panic. The community was deemed pretty safe normally, and in response, Volusia County Sheriff Bob Vail gave parents the following tips as printed in the Orlando Sentinel, which I'll have linked along with all other source material in the show notes. He said, "Don't let your children walk alone in isolated areas. Tell children to stay away from strangers. If a stranger approaches a child, have the child run to the nearest neighbor and always report it right away. Report any kind of suspicious vehicles or people to police. Always know where your children are, where they're going, how long it's taking to get there, and how long it should take them to get back. And if your children do go somewhere, have them give you a call to tell you when they arrive and when they leave to return home." Of course, many of those things Laralee's family already did, so it didn't give a lot of peace to the community. The only thing that would was an arrest of a killer. At about the week mark of the investigation, police weren't releasing much but did give the media outlets some information. They were still looking for the man in the black truck for starters. Also, based on the information they put together while evaluating the crime scene, they felt that Laralee had made it about 200 yards, or roughly halfway to her house into her walk, when she was approached by her killer. Sheriff Bob Vail estimated that she was dead by 3:40 p.m., less than a half hour after getting off the bus. Now, in a lot of the reports, it made it seem like the person came from the other end, like coming from Fatio Road, approaching her and came that way. But some people feel she was kind of stumbled upon from behind and followed. At that point, they had received about 280 tips. They had made contact with 200 people independently to speak to themselves, but they had no suspect. Flyers were also distributed to high-traffic areas, hoping to generate more leads. It took about a week before detectives could sit down with Mr. and Mrs. Spear. They were too distraught to speak prior, and while their grief hadn't lessened in the slightest, they were committed to helping detectives in any way they could with finding out who killed their beautiful daughter. Barbara Spear had driven her daughter to the bus stop that morning, as she did every morning. She said that just before getting on the bus, her daughter sort of looked at her just for an extra moment, but that overall she was in a good mood and she just got on the bus. I can only begin to imagine how much that image of her daughter just glancing at her mother for one extra moment that morning sticks with her and haunts her. She had no way of knowing that would be the last moment she would ever see her daughter alive. In a May 5th piece by Nick Van Clock in the Daytona Beach News Journal, Sheriff Bob Vail told the media that they believed the killer was not only local, but that he remained local. He stressed that the person's behavior may have changed. He said, quote, "When somebody does something like this, their lifestyle changes. Somebody's going to notice a change in somebody. The change could take place in the form of heavy drinking, paranoia, and changes in routine habits, including driving a particular vehicle or visiting friends. The killer may have suddenly left the area. We believe we know what happened. I think it was a crime of opportunity. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time," end quote. By May 6th, the Volusia County Sheriff's Department released a criminal profile of the suspect that they had put together in partnership with the FDLE. The profile stated that the killer may be a white male who lives in the DeLand area, either alone or with his parents, may have an emotional age of late teens or early 20s, may live or work close to the crime scene, may have recently acquired a handgun, bragged about it, and shown it to acquaintances, may be a spontaneous person with a quick temper, may take great pride in his vehicle, may be a youthful or inexperienced offender who left the scene in disarray, may have been in the Deerfoot Road area from 1 to 4 p.m. on the day of the killing, which, of course, that it goes without saying, so I don't know why they said that, but that's what was included. A change in eating and drinking habits and personal hygiene. Inappropriate interest in the crime. The killer may frequently initiate conversation about the case. Act like a different person, and they may have left the immediate area unexpectedly right after. Veteran Sheriff Bob Vail took the case very hard. He told the Daytona Beach News Journal, quote, "I think about it while eating dinner with my wife. I think about it lying in bed at night. It affects every day of your life." On June 1st, one witness broke their silence. It was the bus driver who dropped off Laralee. He wished to remain anonymous, but he told reporters for the Orlando Sentinel that Laralee seemed off that morning. He described her as almost gray, and that it was out of character enough that he considered asking her if she was okay. He also said that in the afternoon, she was slouched way down in her seat as if she was afraid of something. He said that after he dropped her off, he noticed a black pickup truck at the intersection of Deerfoot Road, but the driver was across the street at the stop sign on the other side. He expected the pickup to pull out behind him, but as he got to the next intersection, he noticed that the pickup was not there. Detectives were quick to discount the bus driver. Oh, and they doxed him. Despite him asking the papers to leave him anonymous, the police just named him in the papers. But out of respect for him, I'm not going to, just because I don't think he meant any harm. Sheriff Bob Vail told the Daytona Beach News Journal, quote, "He was interviewed by investigators the day Laralee's body was discovered and on subsequent days, and did not mention seeing a black truck or any behavioral changes in Laralee when she got on the bus the morning of her death. They also said they believed he was just trying too hard to remember things." He also said he called the driver back to answer some additional questions, and the driver said that the Sentinel misquoted him. He didn't mention anything about her being gray in coloring or anything like that. He said she just had a strange look on her face. The Spear family did a public appeal at the request of the sheriff to keep information coming. David Spear spoke on behalf of he and his wife and said, quote, "Since that time, the outpouring of support from the community has been overwhelming, and we want to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to all those people who have sent cards and wished us well, either by cards or flowers or their prayers. Your help is also taken in the form of providing 1,000 or over 1,000 leads that have been called into by the sheriff's department. Unfortunately, the killer is still out there, somewhere on our streets. We're asking you to provide any information that you might have that could lead the sheriff's department to where this person or persons might be located." By June, the 60-person task force was disbanded, and in July, the case was reassigned to a new lead detective, Larry Horzepa. Shortly after he took over, the news began doing little TV spots on the case to keep information out there. While not much more was revealed, they did reveal that at that point, they said she had been shot 3 times in the head, execution style, so just awful. By September 3rd, more detectives were added to the case full-time, a man named Steve Willis, Greg Kunkel, and Tony Lombardo. At that point, Detective Larry Horzepa updated the press by saying that they believed a suspect was still local, and that they had originally started with 36 suspects and they had narrowed their list down to 10. They said that the killer was disorganized and left a bizarre crime scene, with clothes tossed out of a moving vehicle and tire skid marks left at the scene from peeling out and away. Also shared a little breadcrumb about the age and relationship of the suspect, saying, quote, "I think one of the main keys is going to be the kids. Those knowing her, those who went to school with her. I think there are kids out there who probably have some information but don't know it. I think the key will be getting them to step back out of their own lives and take a second look at what they saw around them at the time. Then they can tell us this was out of the ordinary, this was strange, and give us some insight, some information we're still lacking to get it solved, end quote. The next update wouldn't come until mid-November, but it was a big update. That is when a new suspect emerged, and it would change everything. In November 1994, attention suddenly shifted to a young local man. Interestingly, the public first learned that investigators were focusing on this man before law enforcement intended to reveal it. Information identifying him as a suspect was leaked to the media by a confidential source. That source also gave more details about Laralee's crime scene, saying that she had been bound, that there a couple different ways it was described, either that she had been sexually assaulted or that her clothes were strewn in a way that she had at least the bottom half of her clothing removed, and that it gave the impression that there was an attempted sexual assault. And the leak created significant tension within the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, where officials became convinced that someone inside the agency had spoken to reporters. According to reporting at the time, the Sheriff's Office launched an internal effort to determine who had disclosed the information, and deputies and employees were asked to undergo polygraph exams in an attempt to identify the source. The situation became so contentious that the Sheriff's Office eventually held a special press conference in an effort to address the growing speculation and regain control of the investigation. Instead of discussing new evidence in Laralee's case, they found themselves responding to questions about the leak itself and defending the integrity of the investigation. But alas, the name would come out. Bobby Allen Raleigh. He would have been 19 when the murder happened, and he was already in jail awaiting trial for the murder of two men inside a trailer from June of '94. To understand how Bobby Allen Raleigh's name eventually became connected to Laralee's murder, we have to take a step away from her case for a moment. At this point, investigators had not identified Raleigh as a suspect in Laralee's murder, the time I'm about to tell you about. In fact, his name wasn't publicly associated with her case at all. It was another violent crime committed about 6 weeks later that would eventually put him on detectives' radar. In the early morning hours of June 5th, 1994, Raleigh and his cousin, Domingo Figueroa, were at Club Europe in DeLand. At some point during the night, an argument broke out involving a man named Douglas Cox. According to prosecutors, the confrontation ended when everyone left the nightclub, but Raleigh wasn't ready to let it go. Investigators said Raleigh and Figueroa drove away, armed themselves with firearms, and headed to the mobile home where Cox lived. Also inside the trailer was Cox's roommate, Timothy Eberlin. Unlike Cox, Eberlin had nothing to do with the argument outside the nightclub, and I should also mention that this dispute involved a large-scale narcotics ring. He simply just happened to be asleep in the trailer. According to court records, Raleigh entered the home and shot Douglas Cox multiple times. The gunfire, of course, woke Timothy Eberlin, and prosecutors said Raleigh and Figueroa then turned their attention to Eberlin and began shooting at him as well. During the attack, their guns jammed and Eberlin was still alive, and so it was then that they repeatedly struck him in the head with his handgun until he died. The murders shocked Volusia County because of how calculated and violent they appeared, though they were also associated with drug debt and this large-scale operation. Investigators alleged that after leaving the trailer, Raleigh and Figueroa returned to Raleigh's home, where they burned their clothing and attempted to destroy evidence connecting them to the crime. Detectives moved quickly, and before long, Raleigh was under arrest. He would later plead guilty to the murders of Douglas Cox and Timothy Eberlin, and a jury sentenced him to death. At first glance, none of this has anything to do with Laralee Spear. But once Raleigh was in custody on the double murder charges, detectives investigating Laralee's case began receiving information they couldn't ignore. One of the first major breaks came from an inmate named Scott Kennedy. Kennedy told investigators that while he and Raleigh were incarcerated together, Raleigh confessed to killing Laralee Spear. According to Kennedy, Raleigh described driving around DeLand that afternoon before coming across Laralee as she walked home from the bus stop. Kennedy claimed Raleigh said he forced her into his truck, drove her to the burned house on Deerfoot Road, sexually assaulted her, and shot her before leaving the scene. As with any jailhouse informant, investigators had to carefully evaluate Kennedy's credibility and determine whether the details he provided could be corroborated independently. His statement gave detectives a new direction, and they immediately began trying to verify what he had told them. As they continued digging, investigators believed they were uncovering evidence that supported parts of Kennedy's account. According to State Attorney Steve Alexander, witnesses reported seeing Raleigh watching the JV cheerleaders practice on 3 or 4 occasions before Laralee's murder. Laralee had recently earned a spot on the squad, and prosecutors believed those sightings suggested Raleigh may have noticed her before the day she disappeared. Detectives also interviewed classmates and friends who had ridden the bus with Laralee. One friend told investigators that during the 2 weeks leading up to her murder, Laralee seemed frightened by something. She never clearly explained what was bothering her, but the friend said her behavior was different enough to stand out in hindsight. Investigators could never determine exactly what or who had caused that fear, but the statement added another piece to the growing puzzle. Another student on the bus recalled something even more specific. She told detectives that she noticed a black pickup truck following the school bus as it traveled its route that afternoon. According to her, the truck continued behind the bus until Laralee got off at her stop. After the bus pulled away, she looked back and noticed the truck was no longer behind them. Detectives believed the observation could be significant, especially as they focused more attention on Raleigh. Investigators later asked the student to view a live lineup. Defense attorneys were allowed to participate in selecting the fillers who would stand alongside Raleigh to make the lineup as fair as possible. Even with those safeguards in place, the student identified Raleigh as the driver she had seen that afternoon. Prosecutors viewed the identification as one of the strongest pieces of eyewitness evidence they had developed. One thing to note was that Raleigh had dark hair and didn't match the hair description of the person who many people had listed, and they suspected that maybe he had put a wig on that afternoon. As detectives built their case, they also learned more about the man they believed was responsible. Raleigh lived only about a mile north of the Spear family on Deerfoot Road. He lived in a different neighborhood, I should be clear. And so he was, though, familiar with the area Laralee disappeared. Neighbors remembered him very differently. Some described him as a troublemaker who frequently drove through the neighborhood with loud music blaring, who wouldn't turn it down. And others said he was a hard worker, he was willing to help people, someone who had grown up in a difficult home environment but was doing his best. Those conflicting impressions would continue throughout the case. Depending on who investigators spoke with, Raleigh was either a young man who was constantly causing problems or someone who had simply a rough start to his life. Early 1995, investigators believed they had assembled enough evidence to move forward. On January 18th, a Volusia County grand jury indicted Bobby Allen Raleigh on one count of first-degree murder in Laralee Spear's death. For Laralee's family, it was the first time since April that it seemed justice might finally be within reach, though they had some skepticism. Detectives believed they had found the man responsible. All that remained was proving it in court. In the grand jury hearing, according to investigators, Raleigh immediately drove nearly 500 miles overnight to Wise County, Virginia, where he had grown up. Prosecutors said he was desperately trying to get rid of the murder weapon and hide the truck before detectives could connect it to him. They alleged he approached 2 former acquaintances and tried to sell them a 9mm Glock, but neither would buy it. Instead of getting the cash he wanted, prosecutors argued, Raleigh was left holding the very gun they believed had killed Laralee. The state also pointed to testimony that Raleigh suddenly began carrying a pistol in the weeks before the murder. One witness said he had never seen Raleigh own or carry a handgun until shortly before Laralee was killed, and investigators believed that weapon was the same Glock they were searching for in Virginia. There was no DNA or fingerprint evidence tying Raleigh to the crime scene, and prosecutors acknowledged that. Instead, they argued the jury had to take a look at the totality of the evidence. They said the timeline, the attempted gun sale, and Raleigh's own statements all pointed in the same direction. One of the prosecution's most significant witnesses was Scott Kennedy, an inmate who shared a jail pod with Raleigh after his arrest. Kennedy testified that Raleigh repeatedly brought up Laralee's murder without being prompted. And according to Kennedy, Raleigh first denied any involvement, claiming he had nothing to do with it. But over time, Kennedy said those conversations changed. Kennedy testified that Raleigh eventually admitted that he had been at the abandoned house and had watched Laralee die. He claimed Ralelee told him another man had carried out the murder while he was present, although Ralelee refused to identify who that person was. Prosecutors argued that Ralelee was minimizing his own role while still placing himself at the scene. Kennedy also testified that Ralelee made an incriminating comment after learning he had become a suspect. According to Kennedy, Ralelee told him he wished investigators had arrested him immediately after the murder because then they wouldn't have had anything on him. Kennedy interpreted this as an acknowledgement that Raleigh's actions in the months after the crime had created the evidence investigators ultimately used against him. The defense attacked Kennedy's credibility, pointing out that he was a jailhouse informant who stood to benefit from cooperating with prosecutors. They argued his testimony was unreliable and motivated by self-interest. But prosecutors countered that Kennedy knew details about the investigation that had never been made public, details they believed only someone who had spoken directly with Ralelee could have known. In January of 1995, detectives requested blood, saliva, and hair, and Ralelee agreed to it. As the case moved toward trial, Bobby Ralelee was set to stand trial for the murders of Douglas Cox and Timothy Eberlin. Just before the jury selection was scheduled to begin, he changed course and entered guilty pleas in an effort to avoid the death penalty. As part of this agreement, Ralelee agreed to testify against his cousin, Figueroa, who prosecutors alleged had participated in the crimes. The judge accepted Raleigh's guilty pleas but delayed sentencing until after Figueroa's trial. Figueroa was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Once that trial concluded, the court turned back to Raleigh's case, and the judge rejected Raleigh's attempt to avoid capital punishment and sentenced him to death for the murder of Cox and Eberlin. This went on, by the way, for a very long time. The families of Cox and Eberlin were so frustrated by how drawn out it was, as was Laralee's, as it was delaying Raleigh's trial for her murder. It was early 1996 when the case against Ralelee took a huge blow in Laralee's case. As the case moved closer to trial, newly released court documents revealed what appeared to be a potential alibi for Bobby Ralelee. According to a statement from truck stuff owner Ralph Henshaw, who, by the way, was a former detective, Ralelee had brought his dark blue Mitsubishi pickup truck to the automotive shop on the afternoon Laralee disappeared to have bucket seats installed. Henshaw said he remembered the date because he had his own camper in for repairs and that he had a receipt for it. He recalled Ralelee arriving sometime between 3:30 and 4:30 that afternoon and remaining at the shop until around 9:30 that evening, leaving only briefly to buy bolts needed to finish the installation. If these estimates were accurate, they raised questions about whether Ralelee could have been at the scene of Laralee's murder. Prosecutors quickly pushed back. State Attorney Steve Alexander said they had already obtained additional witness statements that they believed would undermine Henshaw's account. According to investigators, Ralelee had originally called the shop that morning to schedule the work, but his mother later called asking if he could instead bring the truck in later that afternoon. Prosecutors argued that the change in plans left enough time for Ralelee to commit the murder before arriving at the shop. Henshaw also told investigators that Ralelee appeared very calm, and while the inside of the truck was dirty, he didn't notice any blood, no gun, nothing unusual. Prosecutors maintained that Raleigh's visit to the shop did not rule him out, and they were prepared to challenge the timeline if the case went to trial. As the case moved towards a delayed trial in the fall of '96, more things weren't going their way. As the trial approached, the prosecution faced another challenge. Crime lab reports showed there was no physical evidence directly linking Bobby Ralelee to Laralee's murder. Investigators had recovered hairs from Laralee's pubic area and from her denim shorts, but forensic testing determined they did not belong to Ralelee. Likewise, Raleigh's hair was not found anywhere on her hands, or the rope used to bind her, or inside of his pickup truck. Fingerprints also failed to connect him to the crime scene. Those reports became public before trial and gave the defense additional ammunition to argue investigators had focused on the wrong suspect. Prosecutors acknowledged the absence of forensic evidence, but insisted it did not change their case, which honestly is crazy to me. They argued the investigation had always relied on circumstantial evidence, including witness statements, Raleigh's alleged actions before and after the murder, and incriminating statements they said he had made. Even without hair, fingerprint, or other physical evidence tying him to Laralee's murder, prosecutors maintained they still had enough evidence to secure a conviction. Now, I get it. If you have a very sound circumstantial case, I get wanting to bring it to trial in absence of forensic evidence at times, but this is forensic evidence that's somewhat excluding him, depending on how you look at it. And apparently that is how it was looked at, because just as the case appeared to be moving towards trial, it took another unexpected turn. A judge ruled there was a conflict of interest involving Volusia County State Attorney John Tanner. Before becoming state attorney, Tanner had represented Domingo Figueroa, Bobby Raleigh's co-defendant, in the unrelated double homicide. Because of that prior attorney-client relationship, Tanner was disqualified from prosecuting in Laralee's case. The governor appointed the 5th Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office to take over, and Assistant State Attorney Richard Ridgway inherited the investigation. Rather than simply moving forward with the existing case, Ridgway started over, and he spent a lot of time reviewing the evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and taking another look at the jailhouse informants, whose statements had become a major part of the prosecution's case. By the end of that review, he reached a very different conclusion. Ridgway found there was still no physical evidence tying Bobby Raleigh to Laralee's murder, and he also included that the jailhouse informants were not credible. Even Scott Kennedy, whose testimony had become one of the strongest pieces of evidence against Raleigh, did not survive Ridgway's review. He noted that Kennedy expected a reduction in his own sentence, that he planned to apply for reward money connected to Laralee's case, and that he had refused to take a polygraph examination, and, like other inmates, had failed to actually provide information that wasn't publicly known. Ridgway also revisited some of the other circumstances that investigators had long viewed as suspicious. He concluded that the student who believed she had seen Raleigh following Laralee's bus may have simply mistaken, because Raleigh lived just north of Deerfoot Road, and that would have been a routine drive, so possibly it was him, but it was nothing serious. He also wrote that Raleigh's trip to Virginia after the murder, which investigators had viewed as evidence of flight, could have another explanation, because Raleigh regularly trafficked marijuana to Virginia, making that trip less unusual than originally believed, and it definitely would have then been something that he was trying to hide. After reinvestigating the case, Ridgway concluded there was not enough credible evidence to prosecute Bobby Raleigh for Laralee Spears' murder, and in 1998 he dismissed the first-degree murder charge. Investigators were back to square one, and it hasn't made much progress from square one since the charges were dropped. After the charges were dropped, David Spear broke his silence on behalf of he and his wife, who had remained quiet. One interesting thing I hadn't shared up to this point is that even when they were building evidence up around Raleigh, David Spear made an interesting comment. He said he just found their police response really fast. And, most families would be like, wow, that's amazing. It was so fast. But he said, we almost found it suspiciously fast. And maybe they knew something was happening in our neighborhood more than we knew about. And that was just something he speculated on. He told the papers, quote, "As far as I'm concerned, they blew it. The evidence they have now, they had then. Nothing has changed. If they couldn't see that they didn't have sufficient evidence, then something's wrong with their office," end quote. They also added that they had really begun to think that Raleigh had committed the crime, and so because they thought the person was in jail who committed it, they began letting their younger daughter walk that same path, and that she had for a long time. And now they were so uneasy knowing that they had let their daughter walk up and down this path that their daughter was murdered on, and that they did so because they thought she was safe. In fact, when the news came out to interview David, he actually pointed out another 7-year-old girl waiting at the bus stop, and he said, "I wonder if that person's family knows what happened on this road, and if they did, if they would let her stay out there." After the murder charge against Bobby Raleigh was dismissed, questions resurfaced about whether investigators had focused too narrowly on him. One of Laralee's former coaches told investigators she had long been suspicious of a classmate of Laralee's named Danny. She said that she had seen him with this group of brothers called the Ridgway Brothers, who were fellow students at DeLand High, and they were known as the Fat Boys. She recalled seeing them together at a gas station in a lowrider truck that matched the description after the Spear murder. However, there was one problem. Oh, and the whole reason why she was looking into Danny is because she said that he had been someone who hung around the cheerleading girls a lot and that he had stopped doing so right after the murder. But the problem was he had been arrested for something and he was actually in Volusia County jail that day for those low-level charges. So in the end, they realized it couldn't be him. In 2008, Laralee became part of a cold case playing deck that was passed around jails. She was the Five of Hearts. And then in 2022, the police department put together a video to try to get information. And I will link that. That's actually the one that has a lot of the videos of the crime scene, so you can get a real visual for the area. In 2024, the FDLE stepped in response to a request from help from the county, and they also raised the reward from $50,000 to $100,000. And with that news, they featured the case on Nancy Grace, so it got another boost in visibility. And remember Ralph Henshaw, the man who became an unlikely alibi to the suspect at the time? Well, he had been a detective in about 10 years prior to the case of Laralee. And now that he was retired from all his careers, he was dedicating time to volunteer and look into her case again. And he's gone over it time and time again. One other lead that didn't come specifically from him that has been talked about on the internet was the fact that on the other end of the road Laralee lived on, where it ended, so not where she got dropped off at the bus, but the other end, that is where her road ends and then it becomes a park. And it was said to have a known transient population. Now, this is not me making transient people or unhoused people criminals. It is just worth noting that a lot of people who may not have been putting down roots there and who may have been wandering around those woods, that was very close to her house. So that's something worth looking into. In recent years, it has been confirmed that there is DNA in Laralee's case, but it hasn't yet matched anyone in the system. So was it a criminal who went to prison right around that time and DNA was never collected? We know that there's criminals in the system whose DNA is not. Was it someone who died shortly thereafter? Or was it someone who committed this crime and then never did anything again? We don't know for sure, but hopefully DNA advancements can finally close this case. More than 3 decades have passed since Laralee Spear left her school bus and never made it home. In that time, her family has endured arrests, dismissed charges, renewed investigations, and years of unanswered questions. Through it all, they've remained focused on the one thing: finding the person responsible for taking Laralee's life. Despite everything that's happened, the investigation remains open, and the Volusia County Sheriff's Office continues to accept tips. If you have any information on the murder of Laralee Spear in 1994 in Volusia County, Florida, please contact the Volusia County Sheriff's Office Major Case Unit at 386-254-1537. You can also email investigators directly at coldcaseunittips@volusiasheriff.gov. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you can contact Crime Stoppers of Northeast Florida at 1-888-277-TIPS. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review on your preferred listening platform and tell a friend. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back next Monday.